The war was 4 years old, and still the Western Front remained, like a chronic disease that men had become accustomed to live with, but conveying a daily reminder of the approach of death. This ragged line, etched into the broad surface of the earth, was the focus of the most gigantic effort ever generated by the human race. More than 1,000 million people were staking their lives, their treasure, and their happiness to upset the equilibrium of power traced out by the Western Front. The Western Front dominated the thoughts of generals. Only here, they were certain, could the issue of the war be decided. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig believed,
"We cannot hope to win until we have defeated the German army."
Defeat the enemy's army. Falkenhayn had tried. Joffre had tried. Nivelle had tried. Haig had tried. The human cost was appallingly evident. For the dead, the war was over. For the maimed, the shell-shocked, of all the armies, the war would never be over. They had been through horrors whose memory would never fade. Worse, horrors that obliterated all memories and even the mind itself. War had made soldiers into children. Children into soldiers. This was a new kind of war, whose scale dwarfed the traditional means to victory, victory by success on a battlefield. This was not a conflict of armies alone, but a conflict of peoples. Peoples armed with all the powers of modern industry and invention. Peoples obsessed by a vision of total victory. They wished to stand triumphant over a smashed, crushed, humiliated, and prostrate foe. Desire for total victory rode the human soul and spurred it on. The mainspring of the world's catastrophe was the mind of man. Victory lay with he who conquered it. Propaganda became the deadliest of weapons, and truth the first casualty.
One got the impression from reading the papers and hearing the talk that the Germans, or the Huns as we called them then, were a horde of barbarians who were descending upon Europe, about to plunge Europe into another dark ages. We read about how they slaughtered women and children and threw babies up in the air and caught them on the bayonets and tortured prisoners of war and all that. I didn't believe all that. In fact, I wondered if the Germans were barbarians of that type, if they were, why we hadn't heard more about it before this war started.
Government censorship in every country made sure that all news was slanted or suppressed.
Standard, read all about it. Evening Standard, all the news. Paper, Standard, read all about it. Evening News.
A British instruction laid down,
No suggestion of offensive actions by the captains of merchant ships should be made. Statements in regard to the use of neutral flags by British merchantmen should not be published. The press are urgently requested to make no mention of the training or use of dogs as messengers with the armies in the field.
government propaganda machines disseminated mental poison by the newest inventions of the 20th century: the cinema film, wireless telegraphy, faked photography. The unchecked, unproven atrocity story was one means by which the hatred was nourished among the home populations. The world was told that the Germans made candle grease and other fats out of human bodies taken from the battlefield to a corpse factory. And such malicious inventions were widely believed. Relentlessly, the enemy was portrayed as a monster of savagery, worthy only of hate. The message never varied: hate, total hate. It was total hate that sustained the demand for total victory.
What is the war itself but the outcome only of British cunning, British lying, British hypocrisy and cant and treachery? No means can be too unholy to combat this hideous octopus, whose tentacles have too long encircled the peoples of the world.
The Huns, vicious in victory, cowardly in defeat, deserve no more consideration than a mad dog or a venomous snake. And it is our duty to humanity to carry death and devastation into the heart of their country. We are out for war. Let it be war to the death.
There are only two divisions in the world today: human beings and German.
The conflict became, for both sides, a holy war to rescue civilization.
I believe in the powers of right and the crusade of civilization. In France, the eternal. In the purity of our cause and the stainless glory of our flag.
Such a war is a heavy price to pay for our progress towards the realization of the Christianity of Christ. But duty calls.
One thing is clear: God must stand on Germany's side. We fight for truth, culture and civilization and human progress and true Christianity.
Few were immune from the contagion of this universal hysteria. Even the novelist Arnold Bennett could write with sincere conviction after a visit to a war cemetery.
And then a tomb with a black cross. Very disconcerting, that black cross. It is different not only in color but in shape from the other crosses. Sinister. The whole devilishness of the Prussian ideal is expressed in that black cross.
Mercy, truth, and love had died, along with respect for the ancient decencies of civilization. People obediently followed their leaders and accepted without question the harsh requirements of their cause: victory by any means. Now, for the first time, the starvation of whole nations became a weapon of victory. The Allied blockade of Germany was complete. Now the Germans were eating less than half the daily food necessary for health. In 4 years of war, more than 700,000 Germans, men, women, and children, died as a result of the Allied blockade. The young and the weak suffered most.
And diet consisted mainly of turnips one day and barley and prunes the next. And then it started again, turnips and barley and prunes. There was no fat. Potatoes were roasted in a little water so that they stuck to the pan. Bread got into a worse and worse state.
German bread was made with grass, tree bark, turnips, or even a flour made from dried blood. Coffee was made from walnut shells, tea from raspberry or nettle leaves. There were 7,000 food substitutes in German shops.
The food situation got worse and worse. We were always very, very hungry, especially the people who didn't get anything else. And I remember very well my mother was so thin that I, a small child, could easily lift her up.
A great nation was being ground down to grey and soul-destroying poverty. The German soldier on the Western Front was being struck at through the sufferings of his wife and children. In a forlorn attempt to break the ring of warships that was starving her industries, Germany designed and built the first submarine merchant ship in the world, the unarmed Deutschland. Before America's entry into the war, the Deutschland made 2 successful voyages to American ports. Her captain and crew were fated for the novelty and daring of their enterprise. Though Deutschland could carry limited quantities of vital chemicals or metals, but she and her sister ships could not solve the problem of the blockade. Only ruthless counter-blockade of Britain could do that. The German government announced to the world,
From the 1st of February 1917, sea traffic will be stopped with every available weapon and without further notice in the following blockade zones: around Great Britain, France, Italy, and the Eastern Mediterranean.
henceforth any ship, even neutral, in these waters would be sunk at sight by German submarines. The vessel that in 1914 had been thought too frail to venture far from German coasts had now become Germany's greatest hope of victory. The great battle fleets of Britain and Germany were impotent onlookers in this unforeseen struggle at sea. There were no stately deployments into line ahead, no thundering broadsides, no victory bells in this continuous, pitiless war of starvation. 2 great nations had each other by the throat with a grip that tightened in convulsive desperation, and one must die. January 1917, 150,000 tons of British shipping lost. February, 300,000 tons. March, 350,000 tons. April, nearly 550,000 tons. Then, slowly, month by month, the U-boat was mastered. Convoys, counterattacks by convoy escorts and by merchant ships now armed with guns, new hydrophone listening gear, depth charges, each step made the British counterattack more deadly. Aircraft searched the seas, ready to bomb and machine gun. Even apparently helpless victims were used to tempt U-boats to destruction. These were the famous Q ships. George wrote,
"It was Britain's grandest struggle at sea, in its magnitude, in its intensity, in the issues that depended upon it. The battle was fought in every ocean and on every trade route. Never were the skill, the daring, and the endurance of British sailors put to so stern a test."
The sea war went on. The submarines went still further afield for gain, refilling their tanks with captured oil and their galleys with captured eatables. British survival still depended on the courage of her merchant seamen.
I have heard of one man who has been in no less than 7 vessels that have been torpedoed. A large number of men last winter experienced days of agony and suffering in open boats. Many of them have had to have their limbs amputated.
Although the British had averted outright starvation, food became scarcer and scarcer. Compulsory rationing was hateful to British traditions. Instead, the government appealed to the nation to ration itself according to a published weekly scale.
4 pounds of bread or 3 pounds of flour, 2.5 pounds of meat, 3/4 of a pound of sugar.
I know that in government circles, deep anxiety prevails. Famine is feared. Stocks of wheat are down to 9 weeks' supply.
On the 25th of February 1918, compulsory rationing was at last introduced in London and the home counties. In April, it was extended to the whole of Great Britain.
Meat, approximately 2 pounds a week. Sugar and fats, half a pound each a week.
Rationing did not put an end to shortages.
I remember going into a shop after not having milk for several days, and they said, if you can produce a baby, you can have the milk. That was out. I went into a butcher's shop to get some meat because we were just beginning to be rationed. And I said, that looks like cat. He said, it is.
The fight against food shortages fell upon a nation short of fertilizers, animal feeding stuffs, and above all, labor. In 1917, the Women's Farm Labor Force, over 230,000 of them by 1918, put on their uniforms. And the fight for higher food production was carried into the fields by a new army, the Women's Land Army. The Lilac Sunbonnet Brigade, as they were called, overcame the skepticism with which they were greeted by the farmers and formed a vital replacement to farm workers, drafted by the inexorable demands of war to the front. Timber, a vital commodity in a war which demanded more and more for pit props, for ammunition boxes, for huts and billets, for duckboards, for trench works, and for buildings, called for more and more labor. Again, women came to help and invaded a man's world with energy and with unexpected skill. Nations came to accept the breaking down of traditions and firm beliefs, intrusions upon old ways, personal liberties. Motor vehicles, when requisitioned for government purposes, rolled impressively into military depots. Compulsory rationing, requisition, national control of industry and shipping and railways, conscription, women in work normally done by men, national scientific research. Now even Britain, with her traditional dislike of large-scale organization and state direction, had yielded to the shrill imperatives of total war. Lloyd George wrote,
"The scope of government control widened steadily and ineluctably until it covered practically the whole industrial life of the nation. The nation concentrated all its great strength and skill on victory."
In every country now, the individual had become a cog in a huge and complex war machine. Whole new industries had been created since 1914 for making aero engines, for making all the instruments required by modern aircraft. A small chemical industry had been transformed into a great national asset. Standardized or prefabricated ships slid down the slipways one after another. Steel for guns or steel for shells. Steel for ships or steel for tanks. There was not enough for all. Engines for tanks or engines for lorries or engines for aircraft. Not enough for all. Britain was now the war factory of the Allies. In France, the bloody losses of 4 years had drained the land of fit men. Her farms needed labor as much as her factories. France was working and striving for victory to the limits of her strength. So was Germany. Endlessly, the trains rolled away from her factories loaded with war material. In every country, the worker was a cog in the machine. Yet often he was better looked after as a cog than he'd been in peacetime as a private citizen. This was one of the strangest ironies of total war. Factory canteens became commonplace instead of showpieces of a few progressive firms. National kitchens or restaurants were set up in industrial areas.
The purpose of this movement, organized by the Ministry of Food, is to instruct the poorer classes how food by proper cooking can be made to yield the most nutrition with the least waste. The food is distributed to the poorer residents, women, girls and boys, who come in large numbers with bowls, dishes and plates.
Better working conditions, medical centers, special housing for workers, high wages. These also were the fruits of total war. Lloyd George told an audience,
"It is a strange irony, but no small compensation, that the making of weapons of destruction should afford the occasion to humanize industry. Yet such is the case. Old prejudices have vanished, new ideas are abroad. This opportunity must not be allowed to slip."
It could not be allowed to slip. Victory depended on industry. The enemy knew this too.
His Majesty the Kaiser has expressed great hopes that the air war against England will be carried out with the greatest energy. His Majesty has designated as attack targets war material of every kind, barracks, and also oil and petroleum tanks, and the London docks.
The scientist and the engineer had created a new dimension in warfare, the air. The demands of total war changed the marvelous toy of 1914 into an instrument to carry death and terror to the enemy's unarmed civilians and destruction to his war factories. In the autumn of 1916, as many as 14 Zeppelins at a time set out for England. 200,000 cubic feet of hydrogen lifted them. The Zeppelin crews were pioneers in the upper air. Each mission was an epic of danger and endurance.
For the attacking aircraft and also for the anti-aircraft guns, a Zeppelin of that size was a sitting target. About over 300 feet long, 50 feet in diameter, at a speed of 60 miles per hour. That was all. It was a very cold affair to go across to England. It was so cold that if you forgot that you didn't wear a glove at a given moment and touched any part of the aluminium structure, you would burn your fingers. And the sandwiches, which we kept in a container in the gondola, were absolutely frozen, stiff, and you had to melt part of it in your mouth until it became soft enough to be bitten off.
German science gave her airmen a triumph in English skies. British science made that triumph only of brief duration. The incendiary bullet transformed a Zeppelin into a blazing funeral pyre in the sky. The death of a great airship was terrible, even to the men who destroyed it.
I approached it from the stern, about 300 feet below it, and fired 4 drums of explosive ammunition into its stern, which immediately started to light. At the same time as I was doing this, one of the other pilots was flying across the airplane, across the Zeppelin from the top, over the top. And to his horror, he saw a man in the machine gun pit on the top of the Zeppelin run to the side and leap overboard.
When I looked up and I saw that this Zeppelin had been picked out by the searchlights. Then there was a small glow which gradually spread the whole length, and afterwards the thing burst into one big conflagration. There was a gasp of, I don't know whether it was abhorrence or whatever it was from the people, very much like the sound that one would get when there's a big firework display. And as it came down, very, very slowly, I heard my mother say, "Oh, those poor men up there." But there was an old Boer War veteran next door who said, "Let 'em frizzle." And so it came gradually down. But someone, I don't know whom, started to sing the Land of Hope and Glory, and it was taken up one after another by the people that were congregated there, until it seemed to, the whole place seemed to be resonant with this singing.
However terrible his death, there was no pity now for the enemy.
Since an airship raid on London has become impossible, the air service is required to make a raid with Gotha bombers as soon as possible.
On June the 13th, 1917, 14 Gothas took off on the first daylight bomber raid on London. Twin-engined aeroplanes, each carrying 1 ton of bombs. Out of science and total war, strategic bombing had been born. Wherever an aircraft could fly was now part of the battlefield. Great cities resounded to the roar of the barrage. Each raid left its tragic human litter. 162 dead and 432 injured in London in June, 54 killed in August. The British public was moved to deep anger. Anger at a new and terrifying ordeal. Anger at the feebleness of London's defences. The government reorganized the defences at frantic speed. A public air raid warning system was begun. Whistles and the firing of maroons heralded the coming of the Gothas. Bugles sounded the all clear. In the autumn of 1917, the Gothas flew by night. The terrifying noise of air raids frayed the nerve of a population born and bred in the safe tranquility of the Victorian and Edwardian age. War production began to suffer. General Robertson warned Haig,
continuous air raids on England are causing interruption in munitions work and having some effect on the general public.
At Woolwich Arsenal, production fell to only 1/5 on the day after an air raid. The British and French air forces hit back at German industry. As Allied bombers ranged over the industrial towns of the Rhineland, the German people proved no more steady under bombardment than the British.
Everybody was frightened. We had to go to the cellar, and we had no electric light in our flat. All clothes had to be put on a chair so that one could dress in no time, as quickly as possible, and rush down to the cellar where the whole house met then. Air raids occurred on cloudless nights mainly, and we heard the planes coming, we heard the anti-aircraft guns, and everybody got more and more frightened.
The bombers turned cities into a battlefield strewn with dead or maimed civilians, women, children. There were no non-combatants in a total war. Everyone was drawn in. Everyone was doing their bit. The war was insatiable. The men had marched away in millions and they had died in millions. Now women had to don service uniform.
Today we had a unique war pageant of a most inspiring kind. A procession of 3,000 young women, representative of all the branches of war work in which female labor and ability is employed, each section distinguished by its own separate uniform.
The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WACS, serve as cooks, typists, telephonists, transport drivers, motorcyclists. Some work in the censor's office, decoding messages in every modern language.
The Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, are employed on cleaning torpedoes, signalling, making mine nets, gas masks, depth charges and sails.
The Women's Royal Air Force, known as the RAFs, are drivers and fitters on aircraft and airships.
Women gained an importance as part of the machinery of victory that they had never enjoyed in their own right. Total war, rather than Mrs. Pankhurst and her suffragettes, gave women the right to vote. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 went even further. Women could now stand for election to Parliament. Everywhere, the most ancient of privileges and prejudices were swept away by the ruthless insistence of the struggle for victory. The needs of war, so simple in 1914, so demanding by 1918, had been met by the scientist and the engineer. The small of 1914 had become mighty. The few of 1914 had become many. The novelties of early days had become vital weapons of war. Modern war changed continuously. Refinements of invention multiplied. The most significant of war's innovations was achieved by man's most urgent need, to break the deadlock of the Western Front. The glowing hatred of the nations put no bounds to the ingenuity and horror of their inventions. Gas that choked was not good enough. In the summer of 1917, a new gas appeared. It had a faint smell of garlic, some said, or of mustard.
It was an oily liquid which evaporated very slowly. And because it had such a faint smell, the troops tended to take no notice of it. And when they did feel their eyes smarting, they were too late. It was a dreadful substance. If they got it on the soles of their boots, it would go through and burn their feet. If they went with some on their boots into a dugout and slept there, they would gas everyone in the dugout. One man could go in with some on his boots into a hut and gas everyone in the hut.
What total war demanded, the scientists and engineers diligently provided. Paris, 7:20 in the morning, the 23rd of March, 1918. An explosion. And another, at intervals of 15 minutes. Yet no German aircraft was over the capital, and the nearest German lines were 75 miles away. A new fear came to a great city. What had caused these explosions? Rumors, speculations seethed through the streets of Paris. Then the French authorities announced,
"The enemy has fired on Paris with a long-range gun. There are about a dozen dead and about 15 wounded."
A gun with a range of 75 miles. Allied experts believed it beyond the scope of technology, but Germany had made it. She had made 3. Each gun weighed 154 tons. It rested on a 26-ton cradle on a railway wagon of 210 tons. The most colossal gun ever made. When the huge French railway guns began to counter-bombard the Germans, this war of artillery, this war of technology reached its fantastic climax. The city and the trenches shared the same conflict. Man cringed beneath the weight of the horrors he had created to gain him victory. Yet victory belonged to no one. The horrors to everyone.